So, in the summer of 1781, a pagan Blackfoot warrior named Sokmapi led an attack on an enemy Shoshone camp in what's now southern Alberta, Canada. The Blackfeet ripped through the Shoshone tents with daggers, and then Sokmapi later recalled, "Our war whoop instantly stopped, and our eyes were filled with terror, and there was no one to fight but the dead and dying. Each man was a mass of bodily corruption." So what he had encountered was a village of people dying of smallpox, which his own people then contracted. A few days later, what he called the bad spirit reached his own camp. They tried to give offerings to the spirits to make it go away. To the bad spirit, they offered whatever they could spare, so that it would let them alone and go to their enemies. And to the good spirit, they offered feathers, tree branches, and sweet-smelling grass in order to try to absolve the spirits who were bringing this disease upon them. Sokmapi later learned from British traders that the white people called the terrible disease smallpox, and he learned that it spread well beyond his own people throughout the land. And between 1780 and 1782, thousands of natives across Western North America, including many areas that were not yet explored by Europeans, succumbed to smallpox. Thousands of Pueblos, Apaches, Comanches, Crows, Sioux, Mandan died from the disease during this outbreak in the 1780s. So how did so many people get it? We don't really know, but odds are it was spread to the Comanches by the Spanish, and then spread to various Siouan tribes by the French, and spread to Shoshone and others by the English. So the epidemic of 1780-82 affected all of North America. It affected the Americans during the Revolutionary War, which was going on during that time, and it was a big catastrophe for them. It harmed their manpower, and a serious source of stress. At the same time, they're trying to fight a revolution. Regardless of the exact origin, the epidemic's significance lies in the way it suddenly and catastrophically deepened the ties between natives and Europeans in ways that affected larger changes going on throughout the continent. The links that brought the disease also brought economic exchanges, they brought military and diplomatic alliances, they brought labor systems, and they brought missionary enterprises that affected natives. And epidemics emerged as one of the lethal forms or lethal consequences of those interactions. Just as smallpox, which was now familiar to natives, solidified connections between Western Native Americans and the Atlantic world in ways that they did not expect. Europe's North American empires were coming to an end, and that transformed their links in other ways. First, the French Empire collapsed with the conclusion of the 7 Years' War. Then the 13 British colonies rebelled against England, and so England lost a big part of its North American empire, though it kept Canada. Finally, Mexico and the provinces of New Mexico, Texas, and California secured their independence from Spain in 1821. Only in British Canada did Europeans still have direct power over North America by 1821, and these successive imperial crises disrupted and eventually terminated the long-established native European arrangements of exchange and diplomacy. And this would be quite bad for many natives. The situation changed for the worse because now they had to face much more menacing political forces. So these images here, this is a 19th century image of a pagan Blackfoot chief. It's not Sokmapi that I talked about. That comes from another source, an earlier source. This is called the Lakota Winter Count, and this was a kind of calendar that the Lakota Sioux would create. You can see the smallpox guys there in 1780 and 81 that represent the plague that spread. And so again, that plague was like part of the connections that were becoming more and more clear between now Americans and natives. Connections that weren't always complementary. In a way, natives were the ones who caused the collapse of the French Empire in North America. Playing both ends against the middle eventually went wrong, and someone who discovered that was a chieftain named Tenagrisson, who was also called the Half King. He was a chief of the Mingo tribe, who was a mixed refugee. They were a mixed refugee tribe that lived in what's now Ohio, and Ohio and eastern or western Pennsylvania. And they wanted to establish themselves. Tenagrisson in particular wanted to establish his tribe as a more prominent player in the area. And how he thought he would do that was by playing both ends against each other. So he purposefully sought out English trading connections and then led those English people into a trap that the French responded to, which started a war. Tenagrisson did this to further his own agenda, but that war ended up breaking up into something much larger, which we call the French and Indian War. So I'll have a few clips on this that will illustrate some of the conflict, but generally speaking, this was one of the first world wars between major empires. For the first 4 or 5 years, France was winning, despite having more or fewer people. England had a lot more people in its colonies, but France had the native alliances, which worked out well for them. And Tenagrisson was actually one of the few natives who sided with the English, at least at first. The French, using their native allies, were able to win a series of battles up until 1759. By 1759, what England did was starting to putting more resources into the conflict that the French could not match, and they became overwhelmed. Once the French started to become overwhelmed, a lot of their native allies abandoned them, realizing the writing on the wall that this is the losing side. Peace treaty was signed in 1763, which swept France off the board of North America. They kept a few fishing outposts up in the north of Canada, and they kept a few Caribbean islands, but that was about it. The British won not only a large military victory, but an enormous diplomatic victory at the end of the war. Right after the war was a consequence of the declining relationships between the English and natives, and this expressed itself in Pontiac's rebellion. Pontiac was an Ottawa chieftain, and he was very upset about the displacement of the French by the English in the various trading forts, middle ground trading forts here in Michigan. What he wanted was a return to gift giving, which he saw as a form of respect that the Europeans used to show to natives like himself. The English weren't about to do that. The English were under budget constraints, and they wanted to save money, and so they were not about to give gifts in order to just start trade. Pontiac was very upset about that, thought that the English were trying to make his people into servants or slaves, and decided to fight back. And so he staged a rebellion which attacked numerous of the British forts, what had been French forts before the 7 Years' War, which are now British forts, attacked a number of them and getting all the way into Pennsylvania before he was finally pushed back, and then later he died after the rebellion. But what he did accomplish was kind of a freak out among the English, who had just won the 7 Years' War against the French, and they were thinking, oh my gosh, are we going to have to deal with these native uprisings now? Like, this is way too much for us to deal with. We want to trade with them. We don't want to have to fight them all the time. It's going to be extraordinarily expensive. So the English responded to that in a way that really upset the American colonists, which was drawing a line on the map, which they called the Proclamation Line of 1763, and basically told the American colonists that all this land here, this is saved for the natives. And the reason they wanted to save that land for the natives was not to protect them, it was to protect American colonists from them, and also protect their trade regimes. If American colonists were causing fighting to go on with the natives, then that's going to cost money. They can't make money off trade with the natives that way. And so the goal here was to establish a trading network where the Indians would be able to provide England with the trade it wanted at the prices it wanted, and do so unmolested. However, the American colonists saw a lot of this land as their right to possess, and they were not about to put up with that line. And so this was one of the grievances that led to the American Revolution. Throughout the same period, the Spanish were declining as well, and so the Spanish were already a third-rate power by this point in the 18th century, and by you get to the 19th century, they're really running out of money. They tried one major last push in the 18th century to establish a number of missions that would Christianize the natives. Established a whole bunch of them, so you can go visit a lot of these sites in California where they tried to Christianize the Ohlone and the Miwok and so forth, Gabrielino natives, and the effort was largely a failure. Natives didn't really take to the mission life very well. The missions were more like plantations where they used the natives as slaves, and most natives were like, if this is what Christianity is about, if it means slavery for us working on a plantation, I'm not exactly for that. And so these missions didn't work out. A lot of the natives only wanted to use them for the military protection against their enemies. But what it did establish was a lot of communication and also spread a lot of disease among the natives. But you can still go see these sites throughout the Southwest. So the effect on native societies of all of this, getting toward the end of the 18th century, was severe. Warfare seemed to never end at this point. After the 1750s through the 1800s, there's just nonstop warfare going on, where the natives can no longer play both ends against the middle. Now they're getting sucked into these wars or getting attacked themselves for land. This adds to their casualties from disease and reduces their numbers even more. It messes up their societies because their societies worked differently when they were at war versus at peace, and so the war leaders became more important than they ever were, which was not the way their societies were supposed to work. And they'd try to use captives and hostages as bargaining chips, but even that had limited utility.